So when it comes to preservation and access, there's some confusion about the difference between websites and archives. Can you tell me more about what the difference is?
Sure. Archives are about the long-term preservation of the data that you collect during your Dell-funded project. And a good archive will make a commitment to you to preserve your data for the long term. And of course, for endangered languages, long-term preservation is extremely important. Websites, on the other hand, are about making it easy for your audience to access the data that you collect during your project, or at least some portion of it. Websites are usually based on newer technologies and have a lifespan of just a couple of years. So what's the difference between storing my data at my home or office versus storing it in an archive?
That's a good question. It's great to think about how you're going to store your data at home or in your office so that you have backups of the data. You can do this using multiple hard drives in different locations, or you can use a cloud-based service like Google Drive or Dropbox. But that is still no substitute for archiving your data in an archive. And the difference is that an archive has a long-term institutional commitment to preservation of that data that is different from what you would get with cloud-based or hard drive storage. So when I'm putting together my Dell proposal, do I need to think about both archiving and website dissemination?
The National Science Foundation requires a data management plan, and Dell in particular requires that applicants contact an archive to arrange for the long-term storage of the data that you collect during the project. NSF also implicitly requires that you plan for dissemination to the right audience. This is what they mean when they talk about broader impacts. In many cases, a website is an excellent and efficient way to disseminate your data to your audience. When writing your proposal, think carefully about dissemination and preservation and make a clear plan for both of them. So how do I find an archive?
So Dell suggests contacting something called the Digital Endangered Languages and Music's Archiving Network. That's a mouthful, but it's abbreviated as Delamon, and you can find them at delamon.org. And this information is also on the Dell website. Delamon is a network of language archives who work with endangered languages, and Delamon archives will be familiar with Dell projects and the expectations. Another good place to find an archive is by looking at institutions that already hold materials in your language. So if there's a place where you've already gone and you know that they have some historic or archival documentation for your language, that would be a good location to actually deposit the information from your Dell project, because they already hold information in that language. So how do I get a commitment from an archive?
Most archivists are ready and willing to help you with your project. Just contact one of the archives and talk to them about the kinds of materials you plan to deposit, and you can also ask them if there is a cost associated with archiving. What will the archive need from me in order to properly process my materials?
Well, again, this is a conversation you should have with the archives. You can contact the archive and discuss what the requirements are. But generally, if you're depositing digital materials like digital recordings or digital video recordings, then the archive will want the highest quality possible, not compressed files, but the highest quality files available. Another thing the archive is going to want is some information about the recordings or materials, some metadata that's associated, and they'll discuss what requirements would be required for that particular archive. Will an archive keep our language materials private?
Well, generally speaking, archives are places where knowledge is stored in order to be shared, but language materials can be especially sensitive. So most language archives will work with you to determine a level of privacy that's appropriate for your deposited items.
So I should just talk to the archive and discuss the kinds of privacy restrictions that I'd like to see.
Exactly, and then you can work together with your archivist to decide an appropriate plan of action. So we've talked about archiving. Why would we want a website for our project?
Well, as we've said, a website is different from an archive, but a website is a really good way to share your information with your audience. So a lot of people in the US now have access to the web via computers, phones, and other methods, and increasingly across the world, web access is becoming a default way of disseminating information. Building a website allows you to showcase information about your language project and your community in a way that is user-friendly and appealing. So what kind of things would we put on our website?
Well, one of the best things about a website is that you can use it to display not just the files that you would put in the archive, but all kinds of other information as well. So for instance, you could put on your website a recording of a legend story, but you could also put in a transcript and some photographs and some interpretive or historical material that will help your audience understand not just the story, but also the greater cultural context that the story comes from. You can think of your website kind of like a curated exhibit in a museum. So the recordings are on display, but so is a lot of other information to help you understand that recording. Some websites also encourage audience involvement. So you could build a website in which you ask users to provide commentary on the recordings, which then in turn provides greater cultural context for the materials themselves. Websites also allow you to organize your materials thematically so that they're easy for your audience to find and very useful. So for instance, you could build a page on your website that is designed for language teachers in which you provide materials to be used in the classroom. Or you could have a web page that is specifically for language learners that contains things like seasonal vocabulary or monthly language lessons, for example. So if we decide that a website is the right way for us to disseminate our project, how do we go about creating one?
Well, one way to do it is to contract this out, to hire an external developer to put together a website for you. But increasingly today, there are a lot of really good free tools out there that will allow you to build a website using drag and drop tools. So these are things like Weebly or Google Sites. Building a website yourself can be a great way to involve youth in the project and build a lot of pride and interest in your project. In any case, whatever way you decide to go, whether you decide to do it yourself or to contract it out, you're going to need to budget for it because there are costs associated with building a website. And this includes things like registering a domain name and getting server space to host and paying hosting fees. So if I'm ready to build a website, what kinds of things do I need to be careful about?
Well, you need to keep in mind that websites are mainly a way to provide access to your materials, and they should not be relied upon as the way that you're going to preserve your materials for the long term. Websites also need to be updated once in a while, so you need to have someone around who can keep working on that for you, and of course you'll need to keep paying web hosting fees. But other than that, you should really think of your website as a fun way to grab your audience's attention. So get creative and have a good time with it. And in time, who knows, the website could become a forum for language use in itself. Can I restrict access to my website?
Definitely. You can restrict portions of your website using password protection. So you might have some parts that are publicly accessible that tell about your project, but you may have other portions of the site that contain more sensitive information that are restricted to community member access.